I'm David Henley. I've been a potter since 1972, and I've been using extruders in my clay work almost that long. My extruder here is one that I built way back in the 70s, and that's what we're going to be using for our projects today. It really doesn't matter what kind of extruder you have. The principle is so basic, they all work just about the same. The important part of the extruder is the die. Let's take a look over here at some of the dies that I have available for my extruder. I keep them here hanging on nails on the wall right by the extruder, so they'll be handy for me to grab and use. I can just pick up a die, put it in the die holder, and put it on my extruder. Also, look over here and you'll see the expansion box that I built for my extruder. This is for when I need to use a large die for a large size extrusion. And here on the table next to the expansion box, you can see some of my large size dies. Now with a two-part die, we use that when we want to end up with the clay coming out in some kind of a tubular shape. In other words, walls with a void in the middle. And so to do that requires a two-part die where we cut a hole out of the die and then add part of that material back in the center of it. Let's take a look at some of those dies. This is the circular die. When the clay comes through here, it's basically making like a big pipe. What happens is the die is mounted in the extruder, the clay is forced through, the clay is forced around these U-bolts, but then the pressure welds that clay back together once it gets on this side of the U-bolt, and then it comes out in a solid piece in a circular shape here. The best shapes for these kind of dies are usually simple geometric shapes, like here's a circle, here's a six-sided die. This one is basically a circle, but I added some little fins at 3 points, 3 equal distant points. I now make all my dies out of aluminum. These are both made out of aluminum street signs. Aluminum street signs is a great material for making dies because the aluminum's easy to cut, easy to work with, yet it's durable and it doesn't rust. You don't need to send your teenagers out to steal street signs if you need some aluminum. They regularly recycle highway signs, and so you just go down to your salvage yard and you can find this material for sale. The U-bolts here are 5/16 inch U-bolts. I found that the next size smaller, 1/4 inch U-bolts are not quite strong enough, and the pressure of the clay coming down on the U-bolts can bend them and get the whole die out of alignment. If we can look closely across the top plane of this die, we want the center section to be just a hair higher. I don't know if that will show up on the video, but this part is just a tiny, tiny bit higher than this side. And the reason for that is because as the clay is passing through, that means that this inside section will shape the clay first, and then just a millimeter later, the outside section will shape the clay. And the outside section is the part we see, so that's the part we want to have the sharpest definition and to be shaped by the clay in the final pass as it goes through. The other good thing about these U-bolts is by adjusting the nuts, I can adjust the center section and make it go up and down a little bit to get it adjusted exactly right with the outside section. So let's get started and extrude something with one of these two-part dies. I've got already loaded in my extruder here, I've got a similar die to this one, and let's put our clay in. I don't think I mentioned before about the clay I'm using. This is just my regular stoneware clay body that I use for throwing on the potter's wheel, and it's the same consistency as I would use for throwing on the wheel. it's hard to describe how wet or dry it is, so I just say it's whatever consistency you would use for throwing on the wheel is probably a good consistency for your extruder. I found that a lot of people have mistakes, have problems because they're using clay that's too wet in the extruder. The clay needs to be stiff enough where after the clay comes out through the die, it can hold its own weight. And that's especially a problem in these two-part dies that produce the tubes. If the clay's too wet, the tube can collapse on itself after it's been extruded. I'm going to fill the barrel up completely here, and then we'll get ready to do some extruding. Now it takes a little bit of extra clay to get started because all that clay has to go around those U-bolts and then be compressed back together on the downside of the U-bolts. And there we're starting to see the clay coming out. Now one thing that's kind of neat that I like is the first piece that comes out every time you put in a two-part die with the U-bolts. The first piece that comes out is going to show how the clay went around those U-bolts and then came back together, and it makes kind of a neat look. I call it the fish mouth. Let me show you what that looks like. And oftentimes I'll put a bottom on something like this and make a little vase out of it just because I like the way that looks. For our purposes right now, for our next piece we're going to make, we aren't going to use this, so we'll discard it. And then we'll extrude some pieces with regular square ends. Now oftentimes when you're extruding, especially with larger pieces, an extra set of hands can be helpful. But there are some tricks that help you to handle it. And so one thing I want to show you is a good way to cut off this clay once it's hanging there from the extruder. This is just a piece of monofilament fishing line, and this is where I want to cut it off. And I'll wrap it around a complete turn and then a little bit more. And now I'm going to pull just a little bit to dig that into the clay and hold itself, so I can let go of that end of the line. And now I can gently grasp my extrusion and pull on the other end of the fishing line, and it'll make a nice, smooth, clean, even cut. And I'm holding the piece, and I can set it on my table to work with it.